Anyway, let's start in anyway.
Okay.
But just to, I think Joe has been a good friend with Far, and he'll tell a little bit more about himself as we go along. Um, uh, it's very important for us to learn about what's happening in the US, what's happening, especially in the funding and the tax arena, in context of mutual funds, private equity firms, other kind of hedge funds, within the world of that. So um, we understand there are a lot of things that have happened,
Yeah.
a lot of developments that are going to happen. We'll have some pick into that.
Great.
So may I request you to
Sure.
on
Absolutely.
the U.S. midterm election and impact on tax reforms. I think
Yeah.
this is what the subject of today's discussion, and we are also very anxious to see what impact it would have on India,
Mm-hmm.
and how should we look at the US. I believe US has just begun to do a little better than past few years.
Yes, I think
So
so.
hopefully there'll be more opportunities for India to also invest in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, US we expect to invest in India.
Right.
But it looks like that with the improved bilateral relationship, we will be able to uh, get a lot more business both ways. Uh, President Obama is going to be in India, 26th of January. That's a Republic Day, and so expectations are both sides pretty high, and it would be very good to see the latest developments. So, Joe, over to you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Please do introduce yourself more in detail so people know about.
Okay.
And we have been working together, on both ways. Um, so it's been a pleasure to them.
Yeah. Thank you for the. Thank you for this. So I'm a tax partner at Webunar+, New York. We've done many projects together with with NDA down here, and I come over about once a year. My focus is just in asset management, so my clients are primarily U.S. mutual fund and U.S. hedge fund advisors. I have many clients that are invested into India, either directly with the whole allocation of the fund or with a partial allocation. My clients include BlackRock, which also includes iShares, which is the world's largest exchange-traded fund platform. I have T. Rowe Price, which has been invested in India for many, many years. We've been working with their tax structure for well over 20 years. I've been working with T. Rowe Price. So luckily, I've had a chance for us to work together. And so what I thought in my visit this time down here to talk a little about the election that we just had in the United States and explain how that's may change the outlook for taxes. Now, in the United States, the Congress is broken into two pieces. Now, we have the Senate and we have the House. And prior to the election, the House was controlled by the Republican Party and the Senate was controlled by the Democratic Party, with Senator Harry Reid being the majority leader in the Senate. And obviously, the president is from the Democratic Party. And so, by having such a split between inside Congress, including a split between Congress and the president, it resulted in very little legislation going through. And in addition, very in particular, Senator Reid prevented any votes on almost any legislation. So there was less than a dozen, we might call controversial votes during the entire year of 2014 because Senator Reid did not want his Democratic colleagues voting on anything controversial. So we had the election beginning of November, and what happened was that the Republicans gained enough seats that they went from the minority to the majority, which means they now will have 54 seats in the Congress. So it says 53 right now, but there's still one more election in Louisiana. Louisiana runs where the top 2 vote recipients then do a runoff election. But the Republicans are expected to win. The polls say that the Republicans are up about 10 to 15% in that Louisiana election. So that will probably end up being 54 votes. So with respect to the House, the Republicans also gained seats. They were already in the majority, but now they've increased the seats to a very substantial margin. What's not on the screen is also at the state level. So the individual states, they also had very large gains to the Republicans. And the states determine the boundaries of the election jurisdictions. And so very often they will be geared to protect the Republicans. So if the Republicans control an individual state government, they can change the boundaries of the House of Representatives elections. And that increases the likelihood that these majorities will become permanent on the House side. So the Ways and Means Committee in the House is the head tax writing committee. Paul Ryan, who ran for vice president with Romney in the last presidential election, is taking over as chair of the House Tax Writing Committee. And in the Senate, the Senate Finance Committee will now be controlled by the Republicans. The fact that the Republicans control both houses has 3 major effects. First, obviously, they control the agenda, and they will control the tax writing agenda, and they are much more pro-business in general than the Democratic Party. But second, because Senator Harry Reid is no longer controlling the vote agenda and the vote scheduling, it's much more likely that the Democrats will negotiate with the Republicans with respect to tax policy. And then the third aspect, which remains to be seen, is whether the president is more likely to compromise on issues now that the Republicans will control all of the legislation coming out of the 2 houses of Congress. So now, right now, there's a session of Congress called the lame duck. What that means is the existing senators and existing representatives are still in office until January. So the old Democrats are still in the majority until the House adjourns, which will be the middle of December, and then the new Congress comes in January. So the legislative session which goes on right now are the people many of whom have already lost their election. So what's considered happening in this session, which again is called the lame duck session, is many of the non-controversial pieces of legislation will go through. Most important one is what we call the tax extenders. These are provisions which have been extended for 2 years at a time, going back for over a dozen years. The research credit, which is very, very important to technology companies, which means as long as they spend money on what they call research, they can get a tax credit for the amount of money they spend. It's very, very important to the IT industry. Section 179 expensing is for small businesses. It's $175,000 of equipment. If they spend that each year, they can just expense it rather than depreciating it. And then bonus depreciation is accelerated deductions on depreciation. That's the Republicans' priorities. The president has indicated that his priority is the earned income tax credit, which is for people who do not actually owe any taxes. They can actually get a negative tax return, or effectively get a refund even when they haven't paid any taxes. And the child care tax credit as well. Now, there has, as of yesterday, since I did the slides, the Democrats and the Republicans got an agreement that is almost there on what this legislation will look like, but it was not including the 2 tax credit things that are there. And the president announced yesterday that he will veto it if he does not get those 2 provisions added to it. The Democrats were not going to include them, but so Democrats are actually annoyed at the president for bringing this up at the last minute. They said it's very, very unusual for him to announce he's going to veto legislation before the legislation is actually written and finalized. So we'll see what happens with that, but that will happen the next week, because the Congress will adjourn beginning of December. Not many days left for the Congress to actually convene. So we'll see what happens. So next, 2015. The big thing on the tax side is tax reform. The Republican Party, which again being the majority now, they really wish to decrease the corporate tax rate. The United States has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. The effective rate that Google pays or Apple pays may be quite low, but the actual tax rate is about 35%, which is quite high, much higher than Canada. I'm not sure if it's higher than India, but it's higher than almost all the European countries today.
And plus the dividend tax and the shareholder.
Yes, to the extent that a company pays a dividend, they can get the capital gain rate on the dividend.
So 35% is the corporate tax rate.
Inside the company, yeah.
Inside the company, so out of $100 gain, 35 is pays tax.
Yeah.
And when they distribute dividend, the shareholder again pays tax.
Yes.
On the dividends at what rate?
15.
An individual.
15.
15%.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Highest individual tax rate is also 35, right? 35.
Yes. So that's exactly right.
So another 15% tax on the balance of the company.
Yeah. So the Republicans wish to decrease that rate, and that's one issue. The second issue, which you may have heard about, is what they call companies expatriating from the United States, or inversions. Okay, so the biggest, most important one right now is Burger King may have an inversion going to Canada, and there's many pharmaceutical companies right now that are
China.
That's right. So they, going back a couple of years, Black and Decker and Stanley, they merged and inverted. Tyco inverted.
Yeah.
There are many, many inversions. So what drives that is the United States is the only country that has a non-territorial system, so that a U.S. company pays tax on all of its worldwide income. It can get a credit for local taxes, but it increases the tax rate in the U.S. Whereas, say, an Irish company or Indian company or a French company only pays taxes in France, for instance, on operations in France, and does not pay local income tax on their operations outside their home jurisdiction. So one of the big issues will be whether they can go from a territorial system to from a global system to a territorial system, meaning a U.S. company would only be taxable on U.S. operations, and then operations outside the U.S. they would only owe whatever taxes are owed in those countries. So it would be a very, very big project for them to fix both driving down the rate and going to a territorial system. It may be so big that it may not be possible that they could actually get it done in 2015, but it's possible. So we'll see what happens with that. But the chances, they say if you're talking about tax policy in Washington, if you predict that nothing will happen, you're usually right. So we'll see. But so that's one of the things that they will clearly be working on. In 2016, the following year, is a presidential election year, and it's impossible to pass large legislation during a presidential election year. So it really has to happen in 2015, or else it won't. Okay. So here's the things I talked about: is corporate tax reduction, pushing down the rate, whether it's 25 or 28, we don't know. So now on the individual side,
how is the U.S. corporation taxed on the foreign dividends, for example?
Okay.
Vis-a-vis individuals within the US is being foreign payments, profits.
Okay. For a U.S. corporation, let's say, has a French subsidiary, then the French subsidiary pays taxes in France. And then when that French subsidiary pays its profit back to the U.S.,
Yeah.
then it pays taxes when the money arrives in the U.S. If they leave the money in the French subsidiary, it's not taxed unless it's passive investment income. Yeah, subpart F, right? It's investment income. For a U.S. individual, they will also be taxed on their French dividends. They're entitled to get the lower dividend rate as long as it's a treaty country. So that's kind of the difference between the two.
But the rate is what 15
Also 15 to
for
20, yeah.
corporate as well as US corporate as well as for the dividends.
Yeah, so a U.S. corporate will pay on a dividend from its own subsidiary. It doesn't pay tax on the dividend. It gets consolidated.
Okay.
But if it got a dividend from another company, it would be 35%.
Oh, that's 35. But individuals are 25.
Yeah.
Or 20.
It would be 20 or 15.
50 or
Depends on your how much
rate.
money you make. So it's 15 or 20.
Oh, okay.
But you're entitled to that lower rate as long as it's a treaty country.
And what about capital gains from sale of foreign shares, like US corporation versus individuals?
For a sale of a foreign company by an individual is 15 to 20%, the same rate. And for a corporation, it's the 35% rate.
Okay. So they don't get reduced rate of 15% for repatriation of dividend back to the US.
No. Yeah.
Okay.
So the other thing which potential tax reform would be to change the individual rate, again pushing down the very high 35% rate, pushing it down to a lower rate. So we'll see if that happens. It's likely that they would have to do some type of reform with respect to entitlements. Right now, the legislation that they're working on, the lame duck, which was those extenders that I talked about, the depreciation, expensing. If the deal they were working on would have been a permanent extension, not 2 years, but permanent, it was $400 billion estimate of how much it would cost in terms of lost revenue. That's viewed as a very, very large number because the U.S. has been running deficits. So the thought is it makes the individual tax rate reduction here harder to achieve because that $400 billion will now have to come from some other source, which will probably mean reductions in what we call entitlements, which is Social Security, other maybe Medicare, Medicaid, or other types of poverty reduction programs. So if the deal goes through in the lame duck, it will very much change the likelihood as to whether the individual tax rate reduction goes forward. Now, these are just a couple of other things. Really what we talked about already is that if we do have a full reform bill, both corporate and individual, we push down the rates, it's going to involve making a lot of other changes in the tax code. One thing that's important that always affects a tax reform proposal, which isn't always understood, is that if we change the corporate tax rate, popular industries like the IT industry, like Apple and Google, their tax rate is already really low because they have the expensing for research, they have depreciation expense. So if you do take the rate from 35 down to 28, the industry that benefits the most is the banking industry because they don't have a lot of tax breaks now. So what's unpopular is to say, yes, we fixed a tax code, therefore Goldman Sachs is going to get a much better tax rate. And so that plays against the ability to get a deal done, is that Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Citigroup, they benefit the most from a reduction in the tax rate because they don't have a lot of tax benefits right now. So now, this is more politics than tax policy. When you may have heard that the president issued an executive order on immigration in the United States, the immediate effect would be that up to 5 million undocumented workers will be told that they will get ability to work, get work papers, and they will not be deported. They are not pursuing legislation at this time to get that done. In other words, the president just did it without any sort of congressional action. That has made the Republicans, who had already won this election from last month, very, very annoyed. And so part of the more conservative wing, the Republican Party, is so upset about the immigration that it may change the ability of all these groups to negotiate effectively, because the thought is that the president is not acting in a way that is amenable to compromise, that he's taking relatively extreme positions without involving other people in the discussions. So the immigration executive order will have a much more impact on tax policy than you would think, even though they're really not related. So we'll see what happens.
So what did this immigration executive order do?
Well, he would basically it's an order not to pursue undocumented aliens in the U.S. and not to deport them if they have children who are U.S. citizens or children who have received green cards in the U.S. Okay, and that's 4 million people. They have to have been in the United States at least 5 years.
4 million people who are children of undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, or they have, or parents of U.S. citizens, but the parents are undocumented.
Yeah. Okay.
Or children whose children are undocumented. Maybe their parents have gotten.
So they will be legalized.
They won't be legalized because the president doesn't have the authority to do that. But they won't be deported.
Okay.
And they will also get a working ability to work.
Some kind of work.
So they can work legally. Okay? So, although that's not really a tax issue, the impact on tax policy is that it's made it difficult for people to compromise with respect to changing corporate policy, individual policy, or any of the other policies, because they feel that the president is not being, forthright or is being too extreme in his position. So that may be right, may be wrong, but again, it affects the negotiation process. So we'll see. And there have been some thought that why don't we link immigration reform and tax reform together, do them in one giant piece of legislation, but now that may be less likely to happen because of the executive action. So, let's see.
Just to step back a bit, I think we were talking about the anti-diversion. It is about, 2 or 3 months ago, there was a pending bill to make the anti-inversion rules a little more stringent. And I remember reading that the Republicans basically argued that depressing the corporate rates would achieve the same purpose without having to make the anti-inversion rules more stringent. Has there been any more discussion on this, and other anti-inversion rules may be more stringent in the future, or is that exactly what you end up?
Yes. What the effect would be, the inversion rule talks about bringing in non-U.S. operational profit back to the U.S. And if you move that company out of the U.S., then you no longer need to bring that profit back. So if you move the company to Canada, Canada has no tax on repatriated profit. So the thought was, why don't we decrease the U.S. corporate rate from 35 to say 25, and there's less reason to delay the profits coming back. And the Republicans feel that lowering the corporate rate will solve the inversion problem, because it's less likely that a company will go to Ireland to get a better tax rate if the U.S. rate is similar to many other countries. So there was a whole spate of inversions proposed in the summer, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry. The Republicans said that they were not going to do anything specific to inversions. What they wanted to do was to do a broader corporate tax reform, particularly lowering the corporate rate. That was their solution. The Democrats and the president wanted an anti-inversion provision specifically and only, like just do a very small amount of reform, which would just prohibit companies from moving offshore. So the Republicans said that that will not pass the House. The Republicans controlled the House at that time. So the president did an executive order on inversions as well. So again, the Republicans were annoyed with that because, again, they felt the legislative process was not being followed. So the Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew, issued an anti-inversion executive order, really. And many Republicans thought that he doesn't have the authority to do that. But there's no real way to generate a court case to overturn it. So as a result, at this point, the Treasury executive order with respect to anti-inversion rules is in effect. And it short-circuited at least one very large pharmaceutical deal, which will not go to the court. Yeah, I think Pfizer. Now, just as a sidelight, the Burger King Tim Hortons deal is not as affected by the executive order, I believe, because Burger King doesn't have any offshore cash to repatriate. So for technical reasons, Jack Lew's executive order doesn't really affect the Burger King deal, which is still going forward. And not to go too far afield, but President Obama has nominated a new Assistant Treasury Secretary who is from Lazard, I believe. And he did the deal for Burger King. And so now the Democrats came out 2 days ago and they're opposing his nomination because he worked on the Burger King inversion deal. So it all kind of plays, it all has different pieces all playing together. So.
But what is his position on inversion of yield? Not against, he can't take it.
But he had really nothing to do with it. Like he's not a tax person; he's kind of a deal person.
Yeah, exactly.
And so and so people are saying that because Burger King didn't have a lot of cash overseas anyway, it didn't really matter. But they are inverting. But it was considered to be a 1 or 2% change in the Burger King tax effective rate, so that it was not a significant part of the deal. And that's why, for instance, in Pfizer. In the deal, these things we appreciate as lawyers, right? But it was built into the contract that if there's anti-inversion legislation, the Pfizer contract was void. There was a material adverse change under the contract, but there was no such provision in the merger agreement for Burger King and Tim Hortons. So next, I want to talk a little about tax treaties. Now, Senator Rand Paul, who's the son of Representative Ron Paul, who just retired, is a relatively younger senator from Kentucky. He is very focused among different issues, but very focused on what he feels is government overreach. He is very focused on, for instance, when Google and Yahoo and Microsoft were turning over private information, he was the one who most supports having legislation specific to restrict the ability of government to collect information. With respect to tax treaties, he feels that the U.S. government has been too easy in agreeing to provide U.S. taxpayer information to non-U.S. governments. He feels that for the U.S. to go into a U.S. person and to get information, they're subject to the U.S. Constitution, which requires certain levels of evidence to be required of wrongdoing. Whereas to turn information over to a non-U.S. government is actually a lower standard. So he feels that the amount of scrutiny, at least the amount of due diligence that's required with respect to U.S. taxpayer information that's turned over to a foreign government, needs to be higher. He also believes that there are too many what we would call agreements between countries on the tax side. So tax information agreements, FATCA intergovernmental agreements. He believes that they're treaties. In the United States, treaties need to be approved by the Senate by a 2/3 positive vote. And the U.S. government doesn't like to submit treaties to the Senate, so they call treaties agreements. And otherwise, they're very similar to treaties. So Senator Paul is quite focused on that issue as well, that he believes intergovernmental agreements should be considered treaties and subject to Senate approval. So there's an old rule in the U.S. Senate. Back when the United States was an agrarian country, they had a rule that if you're a senator and it took you a month to get to Congress, you had to go by force, there was a rule that you could put a hold on legislation until you arrived in Washington, right? So the concept was, it was only in the Senate that any senator could hold up legislation until they arrived in
Actually arrive,
literally arrived. And the idea was you're on a
they
horse.
take 2 months, took 2 months. Those
Yes. And it was considered a
because
reasonable
from Wild West to this side,
you had to cross the country on a horse and the railroads, right? So the rule is still there. But there's technically no time limit. And there's technically no requirement that you're not in Washington either.
Yeah.
So it's called a hold.
So you may be in New York, but you still can hold up.
You can. They have the right to hold.
But you can still visit Washington.
You can be in Washington. You can be in Washington the whole time.
And still not go touch. Oh, okay.
Right. And so the way it works now is that any senator can hold up any legislation, and the approval of a tax treaty is considered legislation for this purpose. So Senator Paul has held up every tax treaty for 4 years. So there has not been a new U.S. tax treaty in 4 years. They've all been signed and agreed to, but they've not been ratified by the Senate. And until they ratify, they don't go into force with respect to the United States.
But it requires
2/3, I think. It could be 3/4, but I'm
But
not sure.
one person not agreeing, the whole treaty gets held up. It requires 100%.
One senator can hold up the treaty.
Even
So
though he may be only one person.
yeah, it's the same rule. It's this trial. It stems from the
Yeah,
1800s, from the horse rule.
It's every senator has to vote.
Yeah, well, he can put a hold on it, right? And the Senate can actually take it up and they can vote to override his hold, but they don't like to do that, so they haven't overridden his hold. So I'll walk through a little bit what the issues that he's focused on. So the first one is, again, the tax information provisions. Under the U.S. Constitution, in the 4th Amendment, it basically says that for U.S. tax crimes, or for any crime, that the U.S. citizens cannot be, what the 4th Amendment says is that U.S. citizens are essentially being investigated for tax crimes without the U.S. government providing any proof or process. So in the U.S., if you're being pursued for a criminal action, including tax fraud, the government is subject to establishing a minimal amount of evidence in order to subpoena your documents, in order to read your mail, in order to read your other types of records. There's a minimum level of justification for what's called a reasonable search and seizure. So here's something that annoys Senator Paul. This is the pending Swiss-U.S. treaty. The current treaty says that the parties to the treaty will exchange information as necessary for the prevention of tax fraud. The new treaty says is a much lower standard for when the Swiss government can request successfully to get U.S. taxpayer information. The new treaty says information as may be relevant to the administration or enforcement of the domestic tax laws concerning taxes. So that is a much easier standard for the Swiss government to show to get information from U.S. citizens. And Senator Paul is not happy about that. This is the list of treaties that have been held up. So Lux, you have Switzerland, Hungary, Chile, Spain. A very, very important treaty is the Spain Treaty. And then amendments, which we call protocols, to the Japanese treaty, the Romanian treaty, the Vietnam treaty. So there's a lot of things being held up. Now, what's going to happen in 2015 with respect to the treaties? Before, remember, Senator Paul was in the minority. Now Senator Paul will be in the majority. Senator Paul is also going to run for president. So he really does not want to be stuck with this treaty thing much longer. But he also can't back down because he's going to look like he's going to look foolish. Right, he's going to look foolish if he just backs down. So he wants a vote to repeal FATCA. So he wants to repeal it. He does not like FATCA, which is the U.S. withholding tax regime. So the thought is they think that they will have a vote to repeal FATCA that will probably not be successful, but a vote to repeal FATCA March or April of 2015. And if he gets that vote, then he'll release all the holds on the treaties. And then the treaties will go forward. That's the likely route. For the senator needs some type of concession by the other party with respect to tax policy. So likely he'll get his vote on to repeal FATCA, which the Democrats refused to let come to a vote during 2014. So then just a little bit update as to FATCA. There was just a request yesterday or last couple of days from HSBC about how FATCA information should be shared among foreign banks. So this has to do with counterparties, including swap counterparties and securities lending counterparties. So it's not that interesting. So this is kind of a review of what we already talked about. It's likely that if we're going to have a corporate tax bill, there needs to be substantial progress in the first 4 months of 2015. If they can't get a lot of progress in terms of the guidelines as to how the legislation may look in the first 4 or 5 months, then it's likely it won't happen in 2015, and it's not going to happen in 2016. And that's it.
Excellent.
So thank you for having me.
This is very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
And everybody is going high on FATCA and all that thing, and suddenly you hear that somebody wants to, repeal FATCA.
Yeah.
So what's your gut feel?
I think they won't repeal it.
Is all controlled by Republicans.
I think even the Republicans at this point would be. Many people don't like FATCA, but I think the thought is that people have already spent all the money.
Yeah.
I think the report is something like $80 billion has been spent to enforce FATCA, even though the total revenue is expected to be about $8 billion. So the ratio is about 10 times cost versus revenue. So the likelihood that they will actually repeal it, I think, is low. The most important reason is that anything that would result in a loss of additional revenue goes into the budget negotiations. And so even that $8 billion goes into the budget, and if they give up that $8 billion, the $8 billion has got to come out from some other place because they're really trying to drive that deficit to zero. The Republicans have said that they want a deal within the next 2 years so that the deficit goes to zero within 10 years. And so that is the guideline that they're shooting for. If we do have the extenders legislation, that's $400 billion over 10 years. So that's already putting them in a hole to try to bring the deficit, the annual deficit, to zero. So it's.
Any question from any side?
What about the internet sales tax? There was something about that. I'm not sure what happened to that.
Yes. So the internet sales tax, and right now, there's a tax rule. It's amazing how much tax affects everything. That, say, in Amazon, which sells product into every state, unless Amazon has a business location in that state, then under the U.S. Constitution, that state cannot tax the the delivery of product into that state. If Amazon has, however, say a distribution center in that state, then that creates nexus. It's very similar to the concept of having a permanent establishment, right? And so if they have that permanent establishment in the state, that state can tax the delivery by Amazon of other properties. Now, there's a side issue with Amazon having to do with all their affiliates. Yeah, so, but putting that to one side, the Congress put through several years ago a moratorium saying that states cannot amend their rules to increase the amount of taxes on internet sales of goods. And there's some legislation as to whether that will go away, which you're referring to. I thought that the deal was in the last couple of days is that they're not changing it right now. That's my understanding, although I haven't studied it. I think that's it, is that the current legislation is expiring, so the internet moratorium on new taxes, I think, expires either last month or this month. But I think the thought is that the Congress will not allow new taxes to go forward, so I'm honestly not positive of the status. But I do know the old legislation expired, maybe next month or last month.
Any questions? Yeah. Okay. Good.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much for
I
having
really
me.
appreciate. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
It's very nice to have this update so that a bit more.
Thank you for having me.
This is very helpful. I think it's very important for us to get insight. And Petka particularly was a bit of a news to me as well.
Right.
And what was his name? Ron?
Yeah, Ron Paul.
Ron Paul.
Yeah.
So all the treaties, which is also a little space. But you say the treaties and agreements are slightly different.
Yes. An
Yes,
agreement.
we consider that international agreements are the same as treaties.
Right. And so the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, requires that the Senate approve treaties, but it says nothing about agreements. And so,
what's the difference between agreement and treaty?
well, Senator Paul says there is no difference, and so the agreements are treaties.
Correct.
And so traditionally the difference has been a treaty is more of an official document negotiated by the two governments, and then an agreement is kind of one level down. Right. Sort of negotiated by like the staff of the U.S. Treasury and the staff, say, of the French Revenue Authority. So it's kind of, and it's easy for one country to back out of one versus back out of an agreement but not a treaty. So the concept that the treaty was just the treaty is an official law between the two countries, whereas an agreement, at least under U.S. law, is not considered a law. So a treaty is considered in the United States the equivalent of legislation, but an agreement is administrative regulation, effectively. And so that's the technical difference from the U.S. perspective. But I think on the international level, there is not the same distinction.
Yeah, because we all understand agreement is the same thing as treaty. Only thing, perhaps in the U.S., if you want to convert it into a treaty, you need some 2/3 or whatever that majority.
That's
or
right.
3/4 or whatever that is.
Right.
So if it is not there, then it just remains an agreement.
That's
But
right.
generally, agreements will be obeyed by both the countries also, even though they are not the Senate.
That's right. They don't need, since they, by their own terms, they don't need Senate approval. They can go into effect
They can
just by a signature. So, but Senator Paul is saying the government is just making everything an agreement because it's easier for the Treasury
You don't
to
have
do
to
it.
go to Senate to.
Right.
In India also, it's happening. It's all agreement. Often people don't differentiate between the two. But normally, treaty, if it is a kind of force of law, then it is it should be before the parliament.
Right.
And only thing is there is some kind of delegated power that is given, to negotiate the agreements. But it's an interesting perspective that
Right.
US does not consider agreements as treaties except for administrative purposes.
That's right.
This was kind of a revelation, right? Not from that perspective, because in India we don't really consider them treaties.
Right.